Eren Yeager is Adolf Hitler. Before diving into this controversial statement, I want to point out a question I want us to think about during this video, which is, can I support one character while not supporting the other? Now, before I can even go ahead and talk about Eren and Adolf Hitler, I have to explain how is it that Eldia is Germany. I want to begin by looking at the aftermath of the Great Titan War and the aftermath of World War I. Beginning with the aftermath of World War I believe it is important to note that when it came to the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not invited. They were not consulted on this treaty until its aftermath, which I believe already says a lot right there. I believe this can actually be compared to what the Tiber family and the royal family does in the Great Titan War, which was have the great houses fight it out and have Marley step in to assume power. Going back to the Treaty of Versailles, I want to go ahead and point out three major points from this treaty. The first of these points that I want to focus on is that Germany must accept the blame for the war and its losses. When it came to this point, the foreign minister of the Weimar Republic, I'm sorry if I butcher this, Ulrich von Brodorf, went on to state in his letter to the president of the peace conference in response to the Treaty of Versailles, "We were firmly resolved to do everything in our power with a view to fulfilling the grave obligations which we had undertaken. We hoped for the peace of justice which had been promised to us. We were aghast when we read in that document the demands made upon us by the victorious violence of our enemies." So from the section I just read, we could see how he agrees that Germany needs to take responsibility for the war, especially since they lost. But in the end of that paragraph I read, he highlights how it wasn't just Germany that caused this many losses. The next main point I want to focus on in the Treaty of Versailles is that Germany must pay 6.6 million euros in reparations, which in US dollars comes to over $1 trillion. And back at the letter, the minister goes on to state that meanwhile, her enemies demand in excess of the agreed condition reparations for damage suffered by their civil population. And in this connection, Germany must also go bail for her allies. The sum to be paid is to be fixed by our enemies unilaterally and to admit of subsequent modifications and increase. No limit is fixed save the capacity of the German people for payment, determined by their standard of life but solely by their capacity to meet the demands of their enemies by their labor. The German people would thus be condemned to perpetual slave labor. So the main two aspects I want to focus from that reading is when the minister goes on point out that Germany must also go bail for her allies. We see this happen in Marley with the Eldians, where they use the Eldians to fight their wars. The minister also goes on to point out that there is no fixed limit, so their enemies can go ahead and increase this. I will compare this to when the Marleyans would justify their treatment of the Eldians. They will always point back to that war, even though that war happened over a century ago. Which leads me to the other aspect, which is the last sentence of that paragraph, with the German people would thus be condemned to perpetual slave labor. For that's something we also see in Marley with the Eldians, for not only do they condemn them to fight their wars, but they also have them work for the benefit of Marley, not for the benefit of Eldia. The final major point I want to focus on from the Treaty of Versailles is majority of German lands are taken and military and naval forces are decreased. Returning to his letter, he goes on to point out that in other spheres also Germany's sovereignty is abolished. Her chief waterways are subjected to international administration. She must construct in her territory such as canals and railways as her enemies wish. She must agree to treaties, the contents of which are unknown to her, to be concluded by her enemies with the new states on the east, even when they concern her own frontiers. The German people is excluded from the League of Nations, to which is entrusted all work of common interest to the world. Thus must a whole people sign a decree for its own proscription, nay, its own death sentence. So the main 2 points I want to highlight from this reading is that 1, the loss of Germany's sovereignty, which we see Eldia has no sovereignty in Marley. They are Marley's people. They are not Eldians. Like, they are Marley. The second thing he points out is that this is a death sentence, which is definitely the case for Paradise Island on Attack on Titan. And plus, Paradise Island has no clue what in the world is happening on the other side of the world, which they didn't even know existed like a few years ago. And so I imagine that if Hitler didn't rise as quickly as he did, that we didn't get an Adolf Hitler till 100 years later, well, Germany would probably be in the same boat the Eldians are in Attack on Titan. So I would like to now shift over to comparing Adolf Hitler and Eren Yeager's rise to power to one another. The similarity they both share in this is that they eliminate those that created their current reality. Starting with Eren Yeager, Eren goes on to consume or persuade his father to wipe out the royal family and take the founding Titan. And later on, Eren will then go on to take the Warhammer Titan from the Tiber family. I highly doubt that it's coincidental that Eren takes the Titans from the 2 families responsible for his current reality, for both families decided to pretty much let the Eldians be enslaved to the Marleyans up in Marley and to allow the Paradise Island Eldians to constantly be attacked by Titans when the royal family had the power to stop this. In the case of Adolf Hitler, he goes on to first take over the Nazi Party, which may actually be compared to Eren taking over the Eldian Restoration Party from his father. But once he becomes the leader of the Nazi Party, he then focuses his strength towards the other parties in Germany, primarily the Weimar Republic, better known as the German Republic, which was the head of Germany during the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler will even go on to assassinate the leader of this party, who was Chancellor of Germany at the time, Kurt von Schleicher. I also want to add in here that both Adolf Hitler and Eren Yeager were both imprisoned at one point. For Eren Yeager, he was imprisoned for killing and taking the Warhammer Titan. What I want to highlight from this scene is that Eren goes on to give his message to someone or to the people. Some speculate that he's talking to a younger version of himself, and others speculate, make a spoiler, that this is the message he is sending to all the Eldians. And I would actually like to compare his message to that of what Adolf Hitler does when he's in prison, which is write his autobiography entitled Mein Kampf. Now that both of these men are in power, next they are going to need allies. And I'll actually like to first focus on their personalities, or more so how other people perceive them before and after. Starting with Adolf Hitler, you have many state how charismatic he was. Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England at the time, mentions this. The same thing is said by the current King of England of that time, which was King Albert before he abdicated the throne. And other world leaders who will point out his charisma. The only person that's mentioned that I could find who wasn't for Hitler before he turned was Winston Churchill. But when it comes to his speeches about his own allies, he goes on to point out, for example, in his Ober-Salzburg speech, that Mussolini is the weakest, for he has been able to break the power neither of the crown nor of the church. He even continues to go to point out that Stalin is a sick man, and that Chamberlain is a gullible fool, basically. He even uses the term nitwit at some point. Switching over to Eren, in the beginning, he was also a charismatic boy, I would say, and I don't think he was faking it, unlike or maybe unlike Adolf Hitler. The truth of the matter is that we're not as involved, not nearly as involved in Adolf Hitler's life as we are in Eren Yeager's life. So I do think that is something important to keep in mind. But anywho, with regards to Eren, he was like a nice boy, angry yes, but nice overall. Until he goes on to kiss Historia's hand at that ceremony, which causes a whole 360 on Eren's personality. In the various scenes we get in season 4, he talks down to both Mikasa and Armin and to his other friends, calling them slaves. And when it comes to his treatment of his allies, I warn you, this is mega spoiler. He ends up turning on Zeke. It turns out that he was never for Zeke's euthanization plan and that he only played along so he could get him to where he needed him to be. Obviously, that sounds very similar to what Hitler does with Stalin. So Zeke is definitely the Stalin in this Jaeger brothers version of Hitler and Stalin. Now, looking more closely at their determinations, they are both nationalistic. Beginning with Hitler, it's important to note that he was a national socialist, which is different from socialist, in that he was very nationalistic. So unlike the other ideologies like socialism and communism and fascism and the others, he did not seek to divide the proletariats from the bourgeoisie, which is the poor, from the wealthy, which he states in his speech to the Nazi Party in Munich on February 24th, 1941. I believe you can compare this with Eren in that he's not concerned in just saving the Eldians on Paradise Island or just saving the Eldians in Liberia, which is in Marley territory, but he wants to save all the Eldians. The final thing I want to look into are these men's ideologies and the aftermath. When it comes to their ideologies, they both believe that doing nothing is not an option, that one must fight to win, for if they do not, they will not win. These are pretty much the exact words Eren says to himself when he's in prison and looking at himself in the mirror. Hitler also goes on to state these words in his speech to the Nazi Party in Munich when he goes on to state that one cannot assume that God exists to help people who are too cowardly and too lazy to help themselves and think that God exists only to make up for the weakness of mankind. He does not exist for that purpose. He has always, at all times, blessed only those who were prepared to fight their own battles. We have seen what can be expected from the help of others. So Hitler at the end of this paragraph goes on to point out how if we simply wait around, nothing will get done. And that was definitely the mindset Eren Yeager also had with the powers in play, especially the Eldian powers, which was the royal family and the Tiber family. Both the Marlians and the Allies have fear of another world war rather that have been out of not wanting to go up against the Eldians and their Titans or up against Germany or just having a whole nother war. But obviously that only led to what they tried so hard to prevent. And as for their allies, the issue with that is that they did very little to ease the issues happening, or they did nothing at all. In the end, both Adolf Hitler and Eren Yeager's conquest led to many deaths, with Adolf Hitler's, its numbers being in the millions, and with Eren Yeager, his numbers being way beyond that. So this leads one to question if one can be for one of these men and against the other, or would that be hypocritical of that person? Thank you for checking out this video, and I would definitely love to hear your views on this. And I would definitely love for you to tell me if I misunderstood anything, whether from Attack on Titan or from the readings I use. And definitely if my history of World War I and World War II are off or there's some misinformation in there, I would definitely love to hear that from you. Other than that, have a great day, week, month, year, decade. Bye.